Hi everyone, welcome to the MrpTech podcast. This is episode 183. My name is Matt, and this is the weekly podcast discussing everyday tech for everyday people. In this week's episode, I would like to talk about something I've been working on this past week. And before I get into that, if you'd like to check out my website, mrptechreviews.com, that's where you can find all of the previous recordings and podcast episodes, anything else that I'm working on as well. So check out that website. You can also go to podnuts.com and check out all the shows on the Podnuts network. So this week I had a couple of things in mind, and last week I had mentioned Linux from scratch as a project that I'd like to work on eventually. And the problem with Linux from scratch that I keep running into is that there's a whole lot of reading that's involved. And I just don't want to sit down and read through documentation on Linux from scratch. And I've looked at YouTube videos, and I've sat down about 4 times to start Linux from scratch. And the motivation just isn't there at this point in time. I really might come back to it very soon. I just have not been feeling motivated as far as to sit down and actually do it. I started a couple of times and just wasn't feeling it. But something else that caught my attention this week, I want to talk to you about. And about a year ago, I had been looking for a project for a Raspberry Pi, and I installed Retropie and had a good time basically with some PlayStation 1 emulators with PlayStation 1 ROMs with Retropie, and it brought me back to some fun games that I played as a kid. And I didn't really do much with Retropie afterwards. The real games that I wanted to play were really not on PlayStation 1 but PlayStation 2, and I've played with other emulators in the past. I've dealt with SNES emulators, and Retropie was a great tool for the Raspberry Pi. It just didn't work as well as I had expected. Now, granted, back then I was using a Raspberry Pi 3. The new Raspberry Pi 4 is much more powerful, and I didn't have a Pi 4 available to try it out try Retropie on the Pi 4. And so not wanting to spend any money right now, I was looking for a project to get into to sort of fill up some time. And I really wanted to get back into playing some games just a little bit, not really a whole lot. So I started looking into PlayStation 2 emulation and realized that Raspberry Pis weren't really all that powerful enough to handle PlayStation 2. Now, I'm not a gamer per se. In the past, I played games a lot. I really don't have a whole lot of time to play games, but with the the whole situation with COVID-19 and being at home a little more than I have been in the past, I was just kind of curious on what I could do. So one of the things that I did is I went to a local store and I picked up a Dualshock 4 controller. Okay, now I haven't had a PlayStation since PlayStation 2, but I have played PlayStation 3, and what I wanted to do as an experiment, I in the past I've used a DualShock 3 controller with the Retropie, and it worked. I was borrowing it from a friend. It worked, and I wanted to check out to see if the DualShock 4 would work in Linux. And there's a couple of things that I had to do first in order to get that PlayStation 4, controller to work in Linux. So I'm going to show this now. In order to work PlayStation 4, you need to download DS4DRV. Now, what that will do is it's all done in the terminal, and you have to install the i386 architecture, so 32-bit architecture. And the other thing that you have to do is you have to install Python 3-pip, and this is the way to get to ds4drv. So you do sudo pip ds4drv, and I realized that I was installing Python 3, so it was actually pip3. So sudo pip3 ds4drv, and that installs it. And then you do the setup. And what I was expecting was to have to use a micro USB cable attached to the controller itself, and that was what I had to do with the DualShock 3 controller back in the day when I did this about a year ago. So in the documentation, it mentioned the fact that what I would have to do is, in this setup, I would have to go into a terminal after this is all set up, and I'd have to run something called ds4drv -hydra, and that would allow me to plug in that micro USB cable and into the controller and have it recognized. And so what happened is when I did that, it wasn't recognized at all. And I was fully expecting that the Bluetooth connection was not going to work at all. So I was trying to get the wired connection to work. That did not work, and I was getting a little frustrated, and I thought that I was going to have to return the controller. And basically what happened is I just finally decided to do the command just for the Bluetooth. And when you do that, what happens is it starts scanning for devices. So I have to hold down the PlayStation button and the share button until it starts to flash. And I'm going to keep holding it down. And then all of a sudden it started scanning for devices, and it's picked up the device. And now I can use the PS4 controller on Linux. And so what I did is I looked into a PlayStation 2 emulator for Linux, and it turns out there's a project that's also available for Windows. It's called PCSX2, and it's an emulator for PlayStation 2. Now, PlayStation 2 was kind of where I stopped gaming. I played Madden and a few other games on PlayStation 3, but I hadn't really done a whole lot of gaming on PlayStation 3. So a lot of my favorite games are on PlayStation 2. I still own the games today. I still have them. They're in my closet on my shelf. And at this point, I kept my favorite ones. There's some legality things about this, but I still own my PlayStation 2, and there's a few things that I did in order to make this work. So there are ways around these things, but then the legality kind of gets a little bit questionable. So PSXX2 was just something that I wanted to spend a little time on. It's not something that I'm going to use every single day. And ROMs for this are available online. I own the games, and what I actually did is I actually used Brasero and made ISO files from my games, and then loaded them that way. And there are directions on the internet how to do that, so I didn't have to use any ROMs or anything like that. So PCSX2 is the PlayStation emulator, PlayStation 2 emulator, and basically what you need to do in order to use this, you have to actually have a BIOS file from a PlayStation 2, and there are tools that you can get where you can get that off of your PlayStation 2. I actually borrowed that tool from a friend. You can find BIOSes online. That's another legality question that I'm not really going to get into right now. But basically, what you do is you can import your settings and then basically set up your controller. And it's set up for a PlayStation 2 controller, but I wanted to use the Dualshock 4, and it's basically the same thing. There's a few other buttons on here that basically aren't going to be used, but they're basically the same controller. So once I did that, I set up the controller, and it turns out that on my system, it's a Intel Core i7, and it's 8th gen, and it has pretty much run flawlessly. I tried a couple of games that I had, like I said, on my shelf in my closet. One was a Tenchu game, if you remember Tenchu, Stealth Assassins, that game from years and years ago. The other one was an old WWE game called SmackDown Bring the Pain, and it was a game that I played in college with an old roommate of mine. We stayed up hours and hours and hours just beating the heck out of each other. It was a fighting game, wrestling game, and brought back some really fun memories, let's say. So I just wanted to play that for a few minutes, and I have to say that it ran basically flawless. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do is I really just didn't want to go through the whole season mode or that type of thing to unlock everything in the game. And it turns out that, of course, I'm probably not the only one to ever think of this. So online there are saved memory card files for the PlayStation 2 that you can basically just download the file. And to kind of show you, on Linux, you have to have the hidden file showing. You go into your .config file and then into the PCSX2 file, and there's a memory card folder. And when you're in that memory card folder, you have two active memory cards. And I've got a couple actually in here that I downloaded. I changed them to .old, but there's the mcd001.ps2 and mcd002.ps2, those memory card 1, memory card 2. And those are the ones that are recognized when you boot up. So I had to rename them to a .old file so that it wasn't sort of picked up. There are other ways to sort of input cheats. You can get them on the internet as well to sort of unlock hidden features and that type of thing in games. I haven't gotten that far yet. Like I said, I just wanted to sort of experiment for a few days. The BIOS that I mentioned earlier, once you have your BIOS information from your PlayStation 2, you would put it in that BIOS folder. So in Linux, it's home. You go into the .config file, then the PCSX2 folder, and then you have all the different, the memory card folder, the cheats folder, BIOS folder. Now, I'm not going to play any games here on the show today, but I have to say that with an i7 processor, really, it kind of brought me back quite a bit. And I'm not a huge gamer, as I've said in the past, but oddly enough, it's kind of a funny story. I was doing some grading, and I was listening to a CD. I have an external drive plugged in over on my right over here, and I've been listening to a lot of old music, and I had put a CD in, and I was listening to it several hours before I had tried this, and I turned my computer off and turned it back on, and then I was messing around with PCSX2, and as it started to boot the ROM, my CD drive started spinning, and it sounded exactly like the PS2 did, because of the PS2 would always spin up the CD, and then you would have the PS2, the PlayStation screen pop up, and that's what happens on PCSX2. That's not an easy name to say. So all of a sudden, I just had this flashback of playing the PlayStation 2, brought back some really good memories for me. And that's really kind of what I wanted to share with all of you today, is these emulators going way back. Now, what I would probably do is, if I were going to play games like this, I know that the PlayStation has backwards compatibility, and I actually looked into buying a used PlayStation 4. At this point in time, I'm not a heavy gamer. I'm probably not going to keep this on my system very much longer. But or if I want to play something occasionally, a couple times a year or something like that, I might keep it. But I did purchase a PlayStation 4 controller, and I have purchased all of those games in the past. So in my mind, I'm still contributing to. I bought something from PlayStation. I'm sure PS4s have the backwards compatibility. I'm sure they'll work okay. But this is sort of just an experience for me that I wanted to try. And it was very easy to take my old games that actually still work and put them, back them up with an ISO file and spin them up on PCSX2. And all that documentation is available online if you're interested in checking that out. It is available on Windows as well. And one of the things that I was looking into next is, have they made an emulator for PlayStation 3? They have. It's called MrpTech3. It's a PlayStation 3 emulator. Now, your mileage will vary with this at this point in time, depending on your hardware and your specs. MrpTech3 is the PlayStation 3 emulator. Apparently, a lot of issues have been worked out over the last couple of years, and things are really starting to improve now. So you may find that certain things will work, certain things will not work with this, and I have not had a chance to try it out yet. And I don't have any PlayStation 3 games to try, and I don't really want to download the ROMs either. One sort of word of caution: if you're going to download ROMs, make sure that the websites that you go to, make sure you download the .iso file, or you're going to have a 1 or 2 gig file. And make sure you hit the right download button. So what I would do is if I'm over a download button, you'll see a little link pop up in the bottom of the screen. And sorry, not a link, a web address pop up in the download on the bottom of the screen. If you notice that address, it'll often have the file name tagged on the end of it. And you'll know that you're downloading the right file, because a lot of these websites, they'll put like 17 different download buttons, and a lot of it is just garbage to make you click on ads and that type of thing. So make sure you're downloading the right file, especially on Windows. Linux, I wasn't all that concerned with, and the reason, Linux is pretty secure, and I feel safer than I would on Windows. Not saying it's perfect, but definitely took me some time to find the files if I was looking for it. I sort of did this as kind of an experiment to see how it would work, and I ultimately ended up just downloading or using Brasero to rip the file itself directly from the game. So just a little tip and word of advice if you're going to do that. The reason I did this is I wanted to see if modern hardware was capable of playing those old, PlayStation 2 type games. Like with Retropie, as I mentioned, it was very easy to play PlayStation 1 games, and I wasn't sure how it can. I mean, obviously, the hardware from today is much different than the hardware from back then, and of course, it's going to be more powerful. So I figured there was a way to play PlayStation 2 games. It just took a little bit of learning, and honestly, it really wasn't all that much work. It was about, I would say, 10 minutes of watching a YouTube video on how to do it, kind of grasping the idea, copying and pasting, and just trying to figure out what this was all about. because I've never done it before. And the hardest part for me was actually the setup for the PlayStation 4 controller, which wasn't all that difficult, except for the fact that I was trying to use that wired connection. I was assuming that Bluetooth wasn't going to work. And it turned out the Bluetooth actually did work, and the wired connection didn't work, which is kind of interesting as far as I was concerned. So the thing with Linux, though, is you need to have that terminal open, and you need to have the device recognized before you open up PCSX2 to boot into the game. So you got to have the controller recognized, then you boot into the game. As far as like frame rates and stuff like that, I didn't mess around with anything at all. I just played the game as is, and it was like playing the PlayStation 2. So pretty interesting. I was sort of brought this up on Discord, asking if anybody ever emulated games for PlayStation 2, and I didn't really hear a whole lot of people did this, but you can use other controllers. You can use like an Xbox controller, you can use any other controller, and there may be other ways to get them to be recognized other than this DS4 DRV program, but you can use basically any controller, even if it's not for PlayStation. And what you would do is go into that controller setting and just customize what buttons you want to use, and then you're all set. So this is sort of just a quick episode on PlayStation emulation. If you might be interested in that, check it out. It works very well, and your mileage may vary depending on your hardware, but that's my look at PCSX2, the PlayStation 2 emulator, and I hope that you all enjoyed that. If you have any questions, send me an email, mrptechreviews@gmail.com. And thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time.